Before the serial killer ever had a name, before Jack stalked London's alleys, or H.H. Holmes built his maze in Chicago, there was another, in the beating heart of the American South. Before electricity lit the streets of fingerprinting caught the guilty, something happened that stunned a city, and then was almost forgotten. This is the story of the servant girl Annihilator, America's first known serial killer. Based on documented historical accounts, police reports, and surviving newspaper archives of the day. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is the haunting, brutal reality of a predator who stalked the sleeping city of Austin, Texas, in the early 1880s, leaving behind a trail of mystery, blood, and shattered lives in a time before modern criminology, when murder moved faster than the law. If you enjoy these slow, immersive journeys through real history, crafted to be listened to while you fall asleep, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us keep these stories alive. And while you're here, tell us, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? We love seeing how far our history travels. Now, let's begin. Austin, Texas, the 1880s. A frontier city rising from scrubland, caught between the dust of the Old West and the quiet hum of a modern world that hadn't quite arrived yet. The streets weren't paved. Not really. They were packed dirt, rutted and dry in the heat, thick with mud when the rains came. Oil lamps flickered outside saloons and boarding houses, painting long shadows across plank sidewalks. Horses clopped steadily on cobblestone patches near the Capitol building, their iron shoes ringing out into the night. Church bells marked time for a city trying to civilize itself, even as it remained unruly beneath the surface. Politicians in high collars debated city ordinances while brothels operated a few blocks away, in plain view. Working class families slept in stifling wooden homes, while the elite held court in their candlelit parlors. And in between them all, servants, young black women, recently freed, now working long days in white households, living in back sheds, in servant quarters, walking streets alone at night. No one noticed them. No one protected them. And in the darkness between alleyways, beneath the amber glow of gaslight, someone noticed that. In the year 1885, something began moving in the shadows. Something cruel and very patient. In the year 1885, something began moving in the shadows. Something cruel and very patient. It didn't come with fanfare or headlines. Not at first. It came in the lull between midnight and dawn, when Austin slept deepest. When the streets were quiet, when the oil lamps burned low, and the horses' hooves no longer echoed off the cobbles. It didn't strike in plain view. It watched, waited, moved softly through the darkness until it learned the patterns. Which homes were unguarded, which windows stayed open in the heat, which alleys stayed quiet. And then, without warning, it began to take. The first body was found early, before sunrise, in a backyard barely lit by morning haze. The victim, a young black woman, a servant, murdered in a manner so vicious that it startled even the hardened local constables. Her skull had been fractured. Her body had been dragged, left posed. No one had heard the killer arrive. No one had heard the killer leave. People whispered, but in 1885 Texas, the brutal death of a black domestic worker wasn't news to shake the foundations of the city. It was a tragedy, yes, but not yet a pattern. Not yet a threat to white households. Not yet something powerful men would act upon. But the killer was just beginning. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't careless. He was learning, studying, perfecting. Weeks passed. Then another woman died. And then another. Always servants. Always at night. Always without warning or sound. And suddenly, police began to notice something terrifying. Each death mirrored the last. Blunt force trauma. Dragged from bed. Mutilated. Posed. Something deliberate. Something more than murder. It was method. And as the calendar moved towards summer, The fear began to spread, not in rumor, but in certainty. These weren't random crimes. This wasn't chance. It was one person, operating with purpose, stalking through the dark like smoke. It became harder to ignore, and harder still when the killer stopped limiting himself to the servant quarters. Women, young, vulnerable, alone, were dying in their beds, in the same brutal way, one after another. The bodies began to multiply, and with them, fear. Women were dying in their beds, always at night, always alone, always brutal. There was a pattern now, undeniable, one the newspapers couldn't ignore, even in a city still drenched in post-war silence and southern politeness. The victims were pulled from sleep into something unimaginably violent. Heads caved in with blunt instruments, often an axe. Some bodies were dragged outside after death, as if to be displayed. Others were found lying beside their beds, nightgowns soaked in blood, their faces crushed beyond recognition. The killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no sounds. Doors were often locked. Windows hadn't been forced. How he got in and out remained a terrifying mystery. Police scrambled. Doctors shook their heads. Families stopped sleeping. Women, especially black domestic workers, started quitting their jobs or refusing to live in the homes they served. Even white families began to panic, realizing that whoever this was, they had no regard for race, class, or reputation, only vulnerability. Every killing struck deeper. One woman was murdered just blocks from the governor's mansion. Another while her husband slept beside her and didn't wake. There was no safety, no sanctuary, no sense left of where the next horror might strike, or why. The city tried to explain it away. Drunken rage, lovers' quarrels, coincidence. But those excuses crumbled under the weight of repetition, because it kept happening. The same brutality, the same ritual, the same quiet vanishing into night. And so, the whispers began. Not in the headlines yet, but in barbershops, at Sunday services, in the back alleys and general stores, where people dared to speak what no official would say aloud. They gave it no name yet, but they knew. Austin residents started whispering of a monster. Austin residents started whispering of a monster. They didn't know his face, didn't know his name, didn't even know for certain that he was a man. But what they did know was this: he killed with purpose. Not drunk, not sloppy, deliberate, precise. The victims kept coming: Mary Ramey, Clara Dick, Molly Smith. Their names etched into newsprint. Their lives ended the same way: heads bashed in, bodies mutilated. A blood pooled in the dirt behind houses and alongside picket fences. As the months crept on, the killer's boldness grew. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was showing off. The papers began calling him the Midnight Assassin. Others referred to him as the Slasher. But among housemaids, barkeeps, and railroad men, the name that stuck was whispered like a curse: the servant girl Annihilator. And once it took hold, that name clung to the city like soot. Women were afraid to sleep. Families dragged mattresses into living rooms to keep everyone together at night. Husbands stayed up with rifles. Dogs were chained near beds. Still, it didn't stop. Still, it came. Austin was locked in a cycle of horror that had no pattern, no motive, no end in sight. One moment, a quiet summer night with heat rising off the porch rails. The next, screaming. A scream so raw it made grown men freeze in place. The victim had once again been struck in bed, dragged, mutilated, discarded like garbage. Her killer vanished into silence before the city even stirred. It baffled lawmen. It humiliated officials. It split a hole in the myth of safety that Austin's rising class had clung to. They had believed themselves cultured, civilized, respectable. But underneath the gaslight glow, and garden fences was now a different kind of truth. Someone was slaughtering women with impunity, and the city was helpless to stop it. To understand how the city found itself in this grip of terror, we have to step back, before the blood, before the whispers, to the foundations of Austin itself. Because this wasn't just any frontier town. Austin in the 1880s was changing fast. It had become the capital of Texas, and with that title came ambition, railroads, government buildings, and a surge of people desperate to be part of the state's next great chapter. Rapid growth had brought wealth, politics, and power. But it also brought shadows and something far more dangerous hiding in them. After being named the capital of Texas, Austin entered the 1880s with a sense of ambition that bordered on feverish. It was no longer just a scattered collection of wooden buildings and wagon trails. It was becoming a city of significance, of governance, of dreams wrapped in stone and steel. Construction boomed. The new state capitol building, an enormous granite colossus meant to rival those in Washington and beyond, was rising above the skyline, declaring Austin's political and architectural aspirations to the world. Rail lines carved through the earth, connecting the city to Houston, to Dallas, to markets and money that lay further east. Businesses opened. Schools were founded. Law offices, banks, and social clubs took root as Austin's population surged beyond 15,000. Families from the north and across the Atlantic arrived with hopes of reinvention, of prosperity, of becoming part of the Lone Star State's glittering new promise. With growth came contradiction. Side by side with marble ambitions rose shanty homes and boarding houses. For every well-dressed statesman smoking cigars in a parlor, there were a dozen working hands laying bricks in the heat, clearing land, building the city's bones. The divide wasn't just economic, it was deeply racial. The scars of slavery had not vanished with emancipation. Many of the newly freed black population, while no longer enslaved, lived under intense scrutiny, prejudice, and systemic disadvantage. They worked mostly in domestic service, construction, or sanitation. Jobs white residents either rejected or felt entitled to control. The servant quarters built behind many middle and upper class homes weren't just functional. They were spatial symbols of racial hierarchy. And when these same servant girls began turning up dead, city leaders hesitated to act. Not because they didn't fear the killer, but because they didn't yet fear who he was killing. Layered atop this was the city's blossoming European flair. Wealthy families brought imported fabrics, Viennese pianos, French crystal chandeliers, and Prussian silver utensils into their homes. Social clubs modelled after London circles were founded, orchestras filled parlours while newspapers quoted British poets. Austin styled itself a refined capital. Cultured, modern, elegant. But beneath that cultured veneer, the city was still young, still raw. Its laws were thin, its police force inexperienced. The past hadn't disappeared, it had simply been redressed in linen suits and lace gloves. It was this precarious mix: wealth, European influence, and deep-rooted southern racial tensions that would shape the fear, the silence, and the chaos that followed. Because the city might have been growing, but it was far from ready for what was stalking its streets. Austin in the 1880s was a city bursting at the seams with ambition, contradiction, and illusion. Its political leaders and social elites strolled through manicured gardens, attended piano recitals, and poured imported brandy into crystal glasses, believing they stood at the forefront of civilization. Wealth was flooding in. Oil money, railroad contracts, land speculation, and the city dressed itself in European pretensions to match. Opera houses hosted traveling performers, new hotels toted Parisian furnishings, and families boasted of German tutors and British china. On the surface, Austin wanted to be seen as cultured and enlightened, a beacon in the wilds of Texas. But beneath this facade ran deep, festering currents of inequality and unrest. The post-war South hadn't healed. It had simply rearranged its lines. Enslavement had ended, but freedom for Black Americans was still conditional, still fragile, still constantly threatened by laws, customs, and violence designed to keep them in place. The streets of Austin, for all their gaslight charm and colonial brickwork, were built on old hierarchies, and nowhere was this more evident than inside the grand homes of the city's white families. Behind nearly every wooden gate, through side yards and narrow alleys, stood the servant quarters. Small, detached buildings where the help lived. Inside, black women, many of them young, many recently freed or the children of freed people, spent their days working from sunrise to deep night. They laundered, scrubbed, ironed, and cooked. They carried water, cared for children, emptied chamber pots, swept porches, and smoothed linens. And when their work was done, they didn't go home. They retired to the sheds behind the house, or small, dim rooms off the kitchen. Separated from the family they served by thin walls and a world of difference. They were expected to be invisible, but always available, quiet but reliable, present but never truly seen. They were also vulnerable. These women, black servant girls commonly employed in white households, were the first to be targeted, and the first to be forgotten. They were the invisible backbone of Austin's new affluence. Black servant girls, often no older than 16 or 17, who rose before dawn and worked until long after the gaslights had flickered out. Many had been born into slavery, or were just one generation removed from it. Their freedom still fragile in a South where the rules had changed on paper, but not in practice. These young women cleaned homes they would never own, cooked meals they would never eat, and lived just yards away from the families they served, yet were separated by the full weight of a racist, post-Reconstruction society. The quarters they slept in were thin, walled, windowless, easy to break into and easier to forget. They were placed there to be close to the needs of the household. But in reality, they were far closer to danger. Their disappearances did not trigger mass outcry at first. The headlines came slow, if at all. But word of mouth, the quiet, buzzing network of black families who knew what it meant when a girl didn't return from work, circulated with mounting dread. To the city's white elite, these murders were tragic, yes, but remote, uncomfortable, easier to rationalize than reckon with. Many police theories centered on domestic quarrels or lovers' rage. Officers questioned the victims' acquaintances far more harshly than they investigated the conditions that made them vulnerable. The idea of a killer preying on black servant girls didn't yet fit into Austin's self-image, because Austin saw itself as something else. Not just a southern town, but a capital, a rising star in the American landscape, a place of progress, order, and pride. But there in the streets swept clean by black workers, among buildings crowned with European facades, and through parlors echoing with German waltzes, a grim contradiction festered. This was a frontier city that wanted the world to see it as modern, refined, and cosmopolitan. But its justice system was undertrained, its police force poorly equipped, and its understanding of criminal behavior rooted more in superstition than science. It could build stone halls of governance and string telegraph wires, but it couldn't keep its daughters or its servants safe in their sleep. It was a city with one foot in the Old South and the other on polished marble, pretending to stride toward progress, while shadows gathered quietly at the edges. It was a fragile balance, this frontier city trying desperately to act modern. And it was about to collapse. Austin in the 1880s was a city dressed in borrowed polish. It mimicked the elegance of older, Eastern capitals, offering tea gardens and lecture halls, parades and patriotic speeches, brass bands playing salsa in the dusty heart of Texas. On the surface, everything looked in order. The new Capitol building rose higher every day, a monument to the future. Electric streetcars had just been introduced, the first west of the Mississippi, clanking through town with proud modernity. Schools were multiplying, civil codes were thickening, and the city's civic leaders spent their evenings in smoky parlors discussing water systems and city planning, as though Austin were destined to rival Boston or Philadelphia. There were picnics in parks, sermons in whitewashed churches, columns in newspapers debating moral progress and the duties of Christian citizenry. Even crime, when it was spoken of, seemed manageable. Bar fights, horse theft, the occasional stabbing gone by morning. Austin was pretending, convincingly, to be civilized, but the reality was more delicate. The justice system was embryonic. Coroners and constables often lacked basic training, and most murder investigations relied on little more than interviews and intuition. There were no detectives in the modern sense, no forensics, no precedent. The thin line between law and lawlessness was held together by pride more than policy, and when that pride was challenged, the cracks began to show. The neighborhoods, rich and poor, were still too close. The police force, too small. The assumptions of safety too untested. At night, the oil lamps cast long shadows, and anyone walking through town could see just how quickly the light fell away, how close the wild still was. City leaders liked to believe they had built a stronghold of reason in a savage landscape. But the truth was that Austin was still wild at the edges, still forming, still vulnerable. And it is in that vulnerability that something found its way in. Something silent, calculating, and merciless. Because for all the lamplight and orchestras, for all the sermons and silver spoons, beneath the surface, something was watching. Beneath the surface of Austin's eager facade, something cold had settled in. It didn't announce itself. It didn't rush. It waited. Among the carriages rattling down Congress Avenue, behind the lace curtains of proud parlors, through the alleys that curved behind boarding houses and brothels, something was watching. It stalked the city not with noise, but with intent. Not like a man drunk on impulse, but like a shadow with a method. Each evening that passed without incident only deepened the illusion that the city had nothing to fear. But behind that illusion, a truth gathered weight, and on certain nights, when the streets were quiet and the oil lamps burned low, it moved. The whispers hadn't started yet, not the way they would later. But unease had begun. Dogs barked at nothing. Servants said they heard footsteps in the yard when no one was there. Laundry disappeared. A man was seen lingering too long near the back fences. Nothing provable, nothing actionable, but the sense remained that something was out there, watching, choosing, and then the silence ended. On December 30, 1884, the fragile calm that Austin had wrapped itself in was shattered with terrifying finality. Molly Smith, a black servant, was found brutally murdered behind her employer's house. The scene wasn't just violent. It was beyond comprehension. Her skull had been smashed with such force that local officers struggled to identify her at first. She had been dragged from her bed, assaulted, and left sprawled in the dirt like discarded refuse. There were footprints, yes, but no clear trail, no witnesses, no suspects. Just violence that arrived like a lightning strike, vanished into the night, and left the city gasping in its wake. And that was only the beginning. It was just after Christmas, when the city should have been winding down into winter rest, when church bells still echoed hymns, and the last of the holiday oil lamps flickered behind curtained windows, that the first murder tore a hole through Austin's quiet. On the morning of December 30th, 1884, the body of Molly Smith, a young black servant, was discovered behind the home where she worked. She had been dragged out into the yard and left under the cold eye of dawn, her body twisted unnaturally, her nightclothes soaked through with blood and dew. The dirt around her was disturbed, and though footprints were found, they led nowhere, vanishing like smoke into the rest of the city. The home she served in stood in an ordinary neighborhood, with neighbors close enough to hear a cough through open windows. Yet no one heard her die. What made her death unmistakable was the violence. Not just murder, but desecration. Molly wasn't just killed. She had been struck in the head with an axe, her skull shattered with overwhelming force. Afterward, her body had been dragged outside, down the back steps and across the yard. Her clothing was torn. She had been sexually mutilated. A horror so pronounced that even seasoned officers hesitated to describe it in their reports. It was the kind of killing that didn't suggest rage or accident. It suggested something far colder, something methodical, something practiced. And as the city reeled from the shock, no one yet knew that this was only the beginning. The servant girl Annihilator had claimed his first known victim, and he had only just begun. She had been struck in the head with an axe. Not once, but with repeated, deliberate blows. Her skull caved in under the force. Her jawbone fractured, the skin split so completely that parts of her face were nearly sheared away. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was far too controlled, too specific, too cold. After death, she had been dragged from the bed where she slept, her body trailing blood, across the packed earth of the yard behind the home. Whoever did it had taken care to move her, not for concealment, but for display. She had been laid out crudely in the open, legs spread, nightgown pulled, and her body had been sexually mutilated in a way that deeply disturbed even the experienced men who responded to the scene. One constable would later remark he had seen death in the war and in barroom killings, but never like this. There were no signs of a break-in. No witness ever came forward with so much as a scream. It was as if the killer had entered and exited the world in utter silence, like a shadow that knew the routines of the household, the layout of the streets, the timing of sleep. When dawn came, and the body was discovered, the extent of the damage made identification nearly impossible. Her employer hesitated before confirming it was Molly. Her features had been so brutalized that, for a moment, even those who had spoken to her the night before struggled to recognize her face. The body was barely recognizable, and the city, though it didn't know it yet, had just glimpsed the beginning of a nightmare. What lay in the backyard that morning was hardly human anymore, not because of what Molly Smith had been, but because of what had been done to her. Her skull, struck again, and again with the blunt end of an axe, had caved in entirely. Bone fragments jutted from her temple like shattered pottery. Her cheeks were split, her jaw dislocated, her mouth frozen open in what must have been a final cry no one heard. The killer had moved her with carelessness, dragging her body across dry grass and soil, leaving behind streaks of dark blood that marked every turn of his passage. Her hands showed no sign of defense, no bruising, no broken fingers, meaning she had likely been struck while still asleep. the violence descending before consciousness could rise. The mutilation was vicious. She had been violated, her limbs splayed unnaturally. Her clothing was not simply torn. It was arranged, as if the killer had paused, looked at what he had done, and made a choice about how to leave her. Her body told a story not just of death, but of humiliation, of domination, of someone who wanted to prove he was in control. There were no fingerprints, no boot tracks clear enough to chase, no locked doors forced open. And there was no motive anyone could explain. She had not been robbed. She had not been publicly threatened. She had no known enemies. When the constables arrived, even the seasoned among them turned away. Their reports were thin, clinical, unable to convey the horror they witnessed. A coroner, more accustomed to illness and old age than butchered girls, wrote his notes with a shaking hand. The reporters came, of course. They took down what they could, asked questions, scribbled headlines. But the shock didn't explode across the city. There were no mass gatherings, no bounty announcements from the mayor's office, no citywide alerts. Because the public shock was muted. She was black, female, and poor. There was no city-wide panic, no emergency meeting of officials, no torchlit patrols combing alleyways for the killer. Molly Smith's death, so brutal, so horrifying, barely made a ripple in the city's consciousness. She was poor. She was black. She was a domestic worker. And to the white upper class of Austin, she represented a reality they had grown comfortable ignoring. Her life had existed in the periphery, essential yet invisible. And now her death was treated the same way. The newspapers offered little space for the story, and when they did, it was framed in vague, clinical terms. Colored girl found dead. Tragic incident. Grisly discovery. Not a call for justice, but a footnote in the back pages. The neighborhoods where Austin's politicians and businessmen lived did not tighten their routines. Church congregations offered no mention of her name. There were no public fundraisers for a funeral. No reward announced. In private, some whispered that it was a terrible thing, but publicly, Austin moved on. She was the help, and the help was expected to suffer in silence, even in death. Even when murdered in her sleep and butchered like livestock, there were others who did notice. Maids in neighboring homes, black families in East Austin, laborers who had known her. They mourned, they worried, they locked their doors with shaking hands. But their fear didn't have the same reach. Their voices didn't make it into the parlor rooms where decisions were made. No one with power saw her death as a warning. And so, the city didn't pause. It didn't prepare. It didn't even believe. Because the police, when asked, waved it off, dismissing the murder as Negro trouble. The authorities dismissed Molly Smith's murder with an unsettling swiftness. There was no manhunt, no forensic theory, no official citywide mourning. Instead, the term, Negro trouble, was scribbled into police reports and whispered by officers who had no interest in searching deeper. To them, it was likely an act of personal vengeance or some household squabble turned deadly. Nothing that warranted public attention, and certainly nothing that threatened Austin's reputation as a city of order and refinement. The implication was as clear as it was cruel. Violence among the black population was unfortunate, yes, but not unusual, and not worth the full weight of the law's concern. And so, what should have been an alarm bell was muffled beneath prejudice. The justice system remained still. The press moved on, and the people in power told themselves that it was over, that the danger had been an isolated thing, a one-time tragedy. But outside the gaze of official records and sanitized headlines, A deeper unease began to stir. Not among the powerful, but among the maids, the field workers, the families who lived near the margins. They felt it. That weight in the air. That sense that something had shifted and would not shift back. One brutal death could be ignored. But one death done like that, in the quiet, with no answer, left a wound that pulsed in silence. They didn't have the language for serial murder. There were no criminal profilers, no FBI bulletins, no warning systems for what was happening. But they understood instinct, and they were right, because something had begun. Spring 1885 brought no relief. If anything, it deepened the nightmare. As the wildflowers bloomed across the Texas plains, and the heat began to settle back over Austin's rooftops, the city's darkest chapter unfolded in quiet increments, name by name, wound by wound. The deaths did not slow. They became a rhythm. Eliza Shelley was the next to fall. A black servant, living behind the home of the family she served. She had been struck in her sleep, her head crushed, her body dragged outside. The killer left her splayed in the backyard, her limbs twisted, her blood soaking into the cracked Texas soil. The pattern was repeating, but no one could stop it. There were no screams heard, no sounds in the night, just death, and then silence. Weeks later, Irene Cross, another black servant, was attacked in the same way. She didn't die right away. She lingered, long enough to speak, barely, before her injuries claimed her. Her arms had been hacked at, one nearly severed. Her skull cleaved open. The physician who examined her said the wounds looked surgical in their precision. Irene didn't know who had attacked her or how he'd gotten in. All she could say was that he came quickly, quietly, and without mercy. Then came the case that changed everything. Rebecca Ramey survived. It was the first time the killer failed to finish what he'd started. She was a domestic worker too, a black woman caring for her young daughter in a servant's quarters near the heart of the city. The killer crept in, struck her down with the same violence, fracturing her skull, but not fatally. She lived. When she awoke, her daughter, Mary Ramey, only 11 years old, was missing. Later, the child was found lifeless in an alley, her tiny body mutilated with the same brutality seen in the earlier crimes. Rebecca's injuries were so severe that she never fully recovered. But her voice, strained as it was, offered something new confirmation. That someone was stalking women in the night, and that he was not content to stop. The city could no longer pretend this was coincidence or random misfortune. The deaths had come too quickly. The wounds too familiar, the victims too alike. All were servant women, all attacked in the middle of the night, all bludgeoned, some mutilated. They were chosen with care, or perhaps not chosen at all, simply found vulnerable, unguarded, asleep. The string of attacks made it undeniable. The killer was hunting one kind of woman, in one kind of place, under one kind of darkness. These women were not killed in the heat of an argument. They were taken from their sleep, their heads bashed in with the weight of something heavy, usually an axe, though the tool was never found at the scene. Some of the bodies had marks of struggle, but others showed no sign that they had even stirred. The attacks were methodical, precise. This was no drunkard swinging in a rage. This was cold calculation. The mutilations escalated. In some cases, the killer left deep lacerations on the chest or abdomen. In others, articles of clothing had been removed and arranged in deliberate patterns. There were signs of sexual assault, but again, always with a detachment that felt more ritual than passion. This wasn't a man overcome. This was someone in control, someone who had practiced, someone who had returned again and again with no sign of being caught, or even clearly seen. The city's fear, once dull and distant, began to sharpen, and yet the authorities continued to speak in vague terms. Unknown assailant, midnight prowler, degenerate. But by now, those terms no longer comforted. They only deepened the dread. There was no explanation for the regularity, no justification for the cruelty, only the certainty that it would happen again. And the most disturbing detail: at least 2 victims were dragged outside, laid out under trees or in gardens. Not just murdered, displayed. They weren't just killed, they were placed. It became one of the most chilling consistencies in the pattern. The way the killer didn't simply leave the bodies where they fell. He moved them, deliberately, sometimes great distances, through dirt yards and over fences, past sleeping homes. He dragged them out beneath the moonlight, and laid them beneath trees or along hedgerows, like grotesque offerings. One body was found slumped beneath a pecan tree, her arms splayed, blood pooled beneath her head like a second shadow. Another was arranged near a garden fence, half dressed, one leg tucked beneath the other in a position almost too precise to be chance. Nothing was stolen, no valuables taken, no frantic escape, just stillness, ritual, a suggestion that whoever this was, he wasn't in a rush. He wanted the aftermath to be seen, understood, felt. To neighbors, it felt like performance. To police, it was baffling. The killer left behind chaos, but no footprints the dogs could follow. He climbed fences without a trace, opened doors without being heard, and somehow managed to choose homes spaced miles apart without ever being spotted. And always, his victims were servant women, taken from their beds into the dirt, brutalized, and left in the open, exposed to the sky as if their deaths were meant for more than just violence, as if they were statements. Even the newspapers, slow as they had been to care, started to shift in their tone. The deaths had come too quickly, too viciously, too similarly. Journalists began to speculate, carefully at first, that these attacks weren't random at all, that they were connected, that someone was behind all of them. But there was a problem. The language didn't exist yet. The framework was missing. The modern idea of a serial killer hadn't entered the cultural imagination. There were no criminal profilers, no psychological assessments, no terminology for evil that repeated itself with structure. Still, the press tried to name it. They called him a fiend, a demon, a maniac who killed by moonlight. Newspapers began whispering of a serial killer. But the term doesn't exist yet. They didn't have the words. Not yet. In the spring of 1885, the American press had no established language for what was unfolding in Austin. They had written about murderers before. Bandits, jealous husbands, lone madmen with a grudge. But this was something else entirely. This was repetition, structure, timing. The killings struck with almost poetic regularity, just far enough apart to keep the city lulled into moments of fragile relief. And then it would happen again. The newspapers stumbled toward a conclusion they couldn't name. Midnight assassin, some called him. A demon in human form, said others. But woven between the lines was a truth they didn't know how to spell out. This was one person, a single figure behind multiple horrors. Not a spree, not a moment of madness, a method, a pattern. Some editors tiptoed around the idea with phrases like likely connected, similar MO, bearing the hallmarks, but the public read between the lines. They sensed the shape of what the headlines couldn't yet print. Something cunning, monstrous, and human was moving through their city, and he would do it again. Each new attack was not just another tragedy, it was confirmation that he was still out there watching. And the streets of Austin, once lively, once warm with music and night markets, began to feel cursed after sunset. It changed how people lived. Gone were the days of open windows and unlocked doors. Families began to gather together on floors, children clutched close, lanterns kept burning through the night, barking dogs became household essentials. Gun shops saw a spike in sales, not for frontier defense, but for bedroom survival. Men stayed up with rifles balanced on their knees. Women refused to sleep alone. The fear seeped into everything, and it had a name now, not in official records, but in whispered warnings passed over porches and through servant alleys, etched into the city's bones. Terrified citizens began to sleep with guns and dogs, haunted by what they now called the servant girl killer. The terror took hold of Austin not like a flood, but like a slow rot, creeping through neighborhoods, slipping past fences and lamplight, settling into every home. Once, people had slept with their windows open to the spring breeze. Now, shutters were nailed shut. Fathers stayed up in rocking chairs, shotguns across their laps. Mothers stitched curtains and whispered prayers. Families moved mattresses into central rooms, so no one would sleep alone. Dogs became as essential as locks. Their barking now something closer to comfort than nuisance. The people were afraid, not of bandits from the hills or drunken gamblers from saloons, but of something far stranger. A man who came in silence, struck without warning, and vanished like a ghost. And yet, the ghost kept returning. The brutality repeated with dreadful consistency, targeting servant women, always at night, always with overwhelming force. The victims were changing from names into symbols, reminders that safety was no longer promised, even in one's own bed. With every new killing, the myth of Austin's civility cracked deeper. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in the capital, not in this beacon of progress. But it was happening, and nothing, not patrols, not curfews, not prayer, was stopping it. The killer earned a name, passed breathlessly in gossip, scrawled in the margins of letters, eventually printed in bold black ink. The servant girl killer. It wasn't just what he was, it was what he turned Austin into. A city afraid to sleep. And then, one woman lived. Rebecca Ramey survived, but she was unable to describe her attacker. Rebecca Ramey awoke to agony. Her skull had been split, her face slick with blood, the world blurred and pulsing with pain. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious. Minutes, hours. But when her eyes opened, her first thought was not of herself. It was of her daughter. Mary, just 11 years old. The room was spinning, her limbs barely responded. But the absence beside her was unmistakable. Mary was gone. Rebecca had been attacked in her own bed, just like the others. Pulled from sleep by the crushing weight of something blunt and unrelenting. The killer hadn't struck once in panic. He had methodically bludgeoned her, aiming to kill, just as he had before. But somehow, she survived. Somehow, even with her skull fractured and blood gushing down her neck, she clung to consciousness. What she couldn't do, what everyone had begged her to do, was describe him. She hadn't seen his face, hadn't heard his voice. There was no silhouette, no whisper, not even the scrape of a boot against the floorboards. The killer had slipped in like fog, and left nothing but blood behind. And when she tried to speak, tried to recall anything at all, her voice trembled and failed. Trauma had silenced what violence hadn't. She was left with only horror and grief, because hours later, Mary was found. Her small, broken body discarded like trash. The same brutality, the same signature. It confirmed what Austin was beginning, only beginning, to admit. The killer didn't just strike at servant women. He had no limits, no mercy, and he was still out there. Each victim added clarity to the pattern. A clear, haunting formula began to emerge. The killer broke in silently, used an axe or iron, attacked viciously, then vanished. He came like vapor. That was the terrible consistency. No doors broken, no windows forced. Nothing to alert the dogs, nothing to wake the neighbors. One moment, a woman lay breathing quietly beneath a cotton sheet, the hiss of the oil lamp fading into silence, and then violence. Always sudden, always devastating. The blunt end of an axe or a sharpened iron tool, swung with such precision it was as though he'd done it before. Not once or twice, but many, many times. He didn't fumble. He didn't hesitate. The blows fell with method, not mania. And when the screaming stopped, if there was screaming at all, he was gone. No footprints. No blood trail. No panting breath disappearing down a cobbled alley. Just the corpse and the ruin he'd left behind. The killer's ability to vanish became part of his myth. A ghost, some called him. A devil. A nightmare that could walk through locked doors and float across floors without a sound. Patrols couldn't catch him. Constables walked circles around fresh corpses, trying to understand how a killer could enter a room, commit acts of stunning brutality, and then disappear without even waking a neighboring household. People imagined him crawling through rafters, prowling beneath floorboards, slipping past curtains like mist. But none of it explained how he did what he did, again and again, with absolute freedom. It was as if the city itself had holes in its skin, and he knew every one of them. And then, when survivors did begin to speak, their stories added another dimension. Multiple survivors claimed they saw a tall, dark man, sometimes barefoot. He wasn't a phantom, not entirely, because despite his near supernatural vanishings, despite the utter lack of evidence left behind after each killing, survivors had begun to whisper of something real. Flesh and blood. A shape in the darkness. A mal. Dark, skinned, silent, sometimes barefoot, sometimes carrying something heavy and blunt. The descriptions never came with full clarity. Trauma-clouded memory. But patterns emerged in their testimonies: his height, his strength, the quiet way he moved. One woman said he had no shoes. Another said she caught sight of him under moonlight, his frame enormous as he slipped into the trees behind her home. He didn't speak. He didn't grunt. He didn't run. He just appeared, and then disappeared again, into the folds of Austin's unlit spaces. These accounts, few as they were, began to erode the city's denial. Because if more than one woman had seen him, if more than one survivor spoke the same details, then he wasn't imagination. He wasn't madness, or coincidence, or folklore. He was real, and he was walking among them. The realization ignited something primitive. Fear turned into action. Men gathered in groups, rifles in hand, patrolling alleyways and porches by lantern light. Entire neighborhoods organized watch squads, often with little more than dogs, and whiskey to steel their nerves. Suspicion bloomed into hysteria. Every stranger became a suspect. Every knock at the door after dark sent chills. The newspapers, which had once tread lightly around the subject, now splashed every new detail across their pages, whipping the city into a frenzy it couldn't contain. Panic set in. Men patrolled neighborhoods. Newspapers fanned hysteria. Torches burned through the night now, not for celebration, but for survival. In Austin's once quiet streets, every snap of a twig or rustle of wind was met with hands tightening on gun stocks. Fathers stood sentry, while their families huddled behind bolted doors, whispering prayers into the dark. Neighborhood patrols became as common as Sunday sermons. Groups of armed men, pacing dirt roads, with growling dogs and swinging lanterns. hoping to catch a glimpse of the monster before it vanished again. They found nothing. Always nothing. The killer remained just out of reach, leaving behind only corpses and questions. Newspapers, sensing both public hunger and private terror, escalated the hysteria. Columns filled with wild speculation and graphic details. Editors blamed alcohol, immigrants, full moons, and divine punishment. Some published crude diagrams of crime scenes. Others printed theories, with no evidence at all. Anything to fill space and feed the dread. It worked. Panic seeped deeper, sharpening suspicions and splintering trust. People turned on neighbors. Innocent men were accused, beaten, questioned without cause. Every drifter was seen as a suspect. Every unfamiliar face became a threat. The fear was no longer logical. It was spiritual. The murders weren't just crimes now. They were an affliction, a sickness in the bones of the city. And because no lawman could stop it, and no fence could keep it out, the imagination took over. Some believed it was a demon, stalking the sinful. Others swore it was a madman, a former soldier, perhaps, twisted by war and hidden in plain sight. Some said he wasn't human at all. A demon, they whispered, conjured by sin or summoned by wickedness. Something sent to punish the city for its secrets. Ministers thundered about morality from pulpits, hinting that Austin's indulgences had opened the gates to darkness. Others leaned toward madness, a man unhinged, a deranged mind unraveling beneath the strain of modern life. Rumors spread like prairie fire. Some said he was a butcher with a taste for blood. Others claimed he was a former Confederate soldier, warped by war. His sanity left somewhere between the trenches and the Reconstruction. A few swore he was a doctor. Who else could carve bodies with such precision? One theory held that he was a foreigner, brought by the railroads, hiding among the crowds, now flooding into Austin's growing neighborhoods. Another insisted he was a preacher, using his position to conceal what he did when night fell. The truth was, no one knew. And that not knowing was what kept the terror alive. Every man became a suspect. Every stranger was the killer. Even close friends grew guarded. Conversations dulled into silence when footsteps passed outside. Wives looked at husbands with unease. Servant women slept with knives beneath their pillows, if they slept at all. The city clung to theories not because they were convincing, but because people needed an answer. Any answer. The idea of a killer without name, face, motive, or end was unbearable. So they made myths. Turned him into something just enough like themselves to feel possible, but distant enough to not see him in the mirror. By August 1885, fear consumes Austin. By August 1885, fear wasn't just a mood in Austin. It was the air itself. Heavy, thick, shared in every glance across every porch. The city no longer slept. Doors were bolted, windows nailed shut. Even the rich, who once believed themselves safe behind manicured hedgerows and masonry, now kept rifles at arm's reach. Servants quit their posts by the dozens, refusing to stay the night in houses where so many others had died. And for those who remained, sleep came in snatches, broken by the creak of wood or the snap of brush outside a window. The nights no longer held peace. They held dread. The city's leaders had lost control of the narrative. Their reassurances meant nothing now. The police were overwhelmed, undertrained, and increasingly desperate. They arrested vagrants, suspected husbands, former convicts. Some were held, beaten, even dragged before public crowds in fits of mob justice. None were the killer. Each wrongful arrest only deepened the city's hopelessness, because he was still out there, always one step ahead, always vanishing before the lamp could be lit. Whispers grew louder, the killer would strike again. The past wasn't just prologue. it was a promise. Newspapers now printed columns with black borders. Editors wrote grimly about the continued rain of blood. Ministers gave sermons not on salvation, but on surviving the night. Austin, this proud capital city of vision and ambition, had become a town held hostage by the dark. And then, as the summer heat lingered into August, and the dust settled briefly over Congress Avenue, it happened again. More victims. Mary Ramey, Clara Strand. The death toll climbed, and with it, Austin's nightmare deepened. Mary Ramey, just 11 years old, had already haunted the city's conscience. She wasn't found in bed like the others. Her mother, Rebecca, had survived the attack, bloodied and broken, but unable to stop what came next. Mary's body was discovered hours later, discarded like debris, her small frame mutilated with a cruelty that made experienced coroners recoil. It wasn't just another murder. It was a boundary shattered. The killer, once believed to be targeting domestic women exclusively, had taken a child. There was no precedent. There was only fear. Then came Clara Strand, a white domestic servant. A shift that shocked even those who believed they'd seen the worst. Up until then, many in Austin's upper class had still clung to the illusion that the killer preyed only on the periphery, on the poor, the black, the unseen. But Clara's murder shattered that defense. She worked in a respectable home, lived in a neighborhood considered safe, and yet she was murdered with the same cold efficiency, bludgeoned in her sleep, dragged, violated. The crime was no longer containable within lines of race or income. It was spreading, and the killer showed no hesitation in crossing those lines. By this point, even seasoned newspapermen struggled to find new ways to describe the horror. The killer was accelerating. Less time between murders, more daring in execution, more savage in aftermath. And all the while, he remained unseen. No footprints. No clear motive. No patterns police could predict. Only aftermath. Only silence. The killer was becoming bolder, faster, more brutal. He evolved, not in form, but in audacity. The killer became more confident, more theatrical, and infinitely more dangerous. Where once he struck cautiously, spaced his crimes weeks apart, now the intervals narrowed. The distance between his attacks shortened. He began choosing homes closer to the city's center, neighborhoods where lanterns burned later, and people still dared to walk after dark. Each killing bore the same marks: blunt force trauma, sexual mutilation, silence. But they were growing in intensity, as if he were testing the limits of what the city would tolerate, and finding no limits at all. Austin's fear turned to fury. Citizens demanded results, and when none came, their desperation turned feral. Vigilante mobs formed. Innocent men were hauled from their beds and interrogated. One, an African-American cook, was nearly lynched before police intervened. Not because they believed he was innocent, but because they wanted to control the narrative. Trust in law enforcement crumbled. Panic festered like an open wound. No one believed in protection anymore, only survival. And then, the unthinkable. He struck in one of Austin's finest neighborhoods, choosing a prominent home, a respected family, and a victim who broke every expectation of his pattern. Eula Phillips, a white woman, elegant, married, a mother, was found murdered in her own bed, the now familiar signs unmistakable. She had been dragged from the sheets, pulled into the yard behind the mansion, and mutilated with a violence that shocked even the most jaded investigators. Attacks now included white women. Eula Phillips among the first, slain beneath the same moon that had watched over all the others. She was everything the city's upper class believed untouchable. Young, white, married to a prominent carpenter. With a child and a home, in one of Austin's most respectable neighborhoods. Eula Phillips had no reason to fear what had befallen those other women, the servants and maids, whose names barely lingered in the news. And yet, on Christmas Eve of 1885, that illusion shattered. The killer entered while the house slept, following the same chilling pattern. Eula was dragged from her bed, her husband struck senseless nearby. Outside in the yard behind their home, she was brutally murdered. Her skull was crushed, her body mutilated, arranged. A length of lumber had been driven through her head, with such force it embedded in the ground below. The coroner's report was almost unreadable in its detail. No one could believe it. Not because it was worse than the murders that had come before, but because of who the victim was. Eula's death didn't just horrify, it appended the entire social narrative the city had wrapped around the killings. The crime had crossed the line. The violence that had been tolerated, excused, or overlooked when visited upon black servant women could no longer be ignored. Austin's white elite woke to the same fear that had been growing in alleyways and back rooms for nearly a year. And the press, long restrained by prejudice or pretense, could no longer contain the fury. The next morning's headline roared across the front page of the Daily Statesman in bold type. A lady killed like a slave. The headline hit like a thunderclap across Texas. A lady killed like a slave. It wasn't just a news report. It was an indictment of a city, of a system, of a silence that had festered for too long. For nearly a year, Austin's newspapers had treated the killings of black women with distance, often cloaked in euphemisms or buried beneath advertisements. But the murder of Eula Phillips, a white woman of standing, of domestic respectability, forced a reckoning. The line that had separated the respectable from the expendable had been crossed in blood. The phrase was deliberate, shocking. Like a slave. It called out not just the nature of the crime, but the city's collective failure to react when the victims had been black, poor, and powerless. Eula's murder was no more brutal than those that had come before, but now people listened. Because it had happened to someone within the boundaries of privilege. Because now the terror had entered drawing rooms, not just servant quarters. The response was immediate. More guards, more outrage, more letters to editors demanding justice. But beneath that outrage simmered something else. Regret. A dawning realization that the terror had always been equal in its cruelty, but not in its recognition. And in that uncomfortable moment, the class and racial lines began to blur. As the boundary between victim and witness frayed, so too did Austin's social order. For months, the city had compartmentalized its terror, allowing race and class to define the contours of who mattered most in life and death. But now, that scaffolding collapsed. The murders crossed lines. The panic crossed lines. And for the first time, those lines no longer offered safety to anyone. White families, once content to blame Negro crime from a safe distance, were now clutching firearms with the same trembling urgency as the black families they'd once ignored. The elite, who had once scoffed at the idea of a phantom killer, now whispered his name behind velvet drapes. Servant women fled their posts regardless of race. Employers, desperate to retain help, offered to board staff indoors or share sleeping quarters. A shocking break from tradition that underscored just how deep the fear had sunk. For a brief, flickering moment, pain became a common language. The unthinkable had happened. Class and color no longer shielded anyone from the shadow moving through Austin's nights. But solidarity never comes easily where power is still uneven. In their failure to capture the killer, the police reverted to old reflexes. Desperate to appear in control, they turned not toward justice, but toward blame. Lacking evidence, they chose targets. Men who couldn't defend themselves. Men whose skin marked them as expendable. Black men were rounded up indiscriminately. Neighbors, co-workers, even the partners of murdered women. Some were accused outright. Others were held without charge, questioned under duress, and paraded as scapegoats before a city baying for answers. The killer was still free. But the arrests had begun. The fear had mutated into scapegoating. In the absence of answers, and under mounting pressure from newspapers, ministers, and an increasingly furious public, the police turned on those closest to the murdered women. Not the distant stranger, not the ghost slipping between alleyways, but the black men who lived in the victims' homes, loved them, worked beside them, mourned them. They were convenient, familiar, powerless to resist. Some were arrested with no warrant at all. A few were held for weeks without formal charges, subjected to interrogations that leaned far more on brutality than logic. One man, a partner of a slain servant, was beaten until he confessed, though he later retracted the statement. Another was jailed simply for not having an alibi, though no one else in Austin did either. These weren't arrests meant to stop the killer. They were meant to prove action. To give the illusion of control when the city had none. But it didn't work. The killings didn't stop. In fact, they escalated. And the public, once eager to believe the threat had been contained, began to recognize the truth. The wrong men were in jail. The right one, whoever he was, hadn't missed a beat. Shamed by failure and desperate for answers, Austin's mayor took an extraordinary step. He hired private detectives. Not local men, but outsiders. Investigators from Houston, and even from the north, brought in with the hope that fresh eyes, unhindered by Austin's prejudices, might finally catch the phantom haunting its streets. He had eluded everything: watchful neighbors, armed patrols, public hysteria, even a growing pile of conflicting police theories. So, in desperation and shame, Austin's mayor took the hunt beyond city walls. Local law enforcement had failed. The public knew it. The newspapers printed it. The killer wasn't just mocking the police. He was dismantling their authority. So the city reached elsewhere. Private detectives from Houston, Dallas, and even as far as Chicago were brought in. Men who claimed they'd seen the worst, solved crimes that baffled others, navigated cities twice the size of Austin. They arrived with leather satchels, stovepipe hats, crisp notebooks, and the quiet confidence of professionals who believed that reason could still impose itself on horror. Some came with forensic ambitions, studying footprints and tool marks. Others leaned on psychology, attempting to build a profile. Though the term didn't yet exist in any formal sense, they scoured alleyways, questioned neighbors, mapped crime scenes in fastidious detail, and interviewed anyone who might have heard anything. For a time, it gave the city hope. Their presence was symbolic: real men, real detectives, real action. But as days became weeks, then months, hope eroded into silence, because the killer had already vanished into it. Despite extensive efforts, over 400 men were questioned: vagrants, soldiers, butchers, even local politicians. But no leads emerged, not one that held, not one that led anywhere, but back to the same dead end, a shadow with a face no one could clearly recall, a name no one ever spoke. The interrogations stretched into months. Over 400 men were questioned: laborers, drifters, soldiers recently returned from duty, even local tradesmen and city employees. Each new name was whispered with hope or dread, dragged into the spotlight by nothing more than a rumor or a resemblance. Some were held for days. others for weeks. But none of them matched the evidence, or what little evidence there was. The killer, it seemed, was either someone no one expected, or someone the city had never seen. Frustration built with each dead end. The detectives, private and official alike, turned over every theory: crimes of passion, ritual killings, insanity, revenge. Nothing held. Nothing explained the silence, the precision, the consistency. The killer didn't make mistakes. He didn't leave clues. He didn't tire. Austin, once a town of easy rhythms and bustling markets, now pulsed with suspicion. Every man became a potential murderer. Every stranger drew side, eyes and whispers. The fear was no longer whispered in alleys or back rooms. It was shouted in meeting halls and scrawled in furious editorials. Citizens wrote letters to the mayor, to the governor, to the president if they had to. They demanded protection. They demanded light. And finally, the city moved. Public pressure forced action. Street after street, those once swathed in shadow, were fitted with new gas-powered streetlights, their amber glow flickering to life as Austin tried to reclaim the night. And where light didn't reach, night patrols were doubled. More boots on cobblestones, more rifles on porches, more eyes scanning the darkness for a figure they could neither name nor see. The killer hadn't been caught. But at last, the city was changing for him. The gaslights flickered to life with a hiss, casting their golden haze across the narrow streets of Austin. For the first time in its short, ambitious history, the city pulsed with light long after sunset. Lamps dotted the roads like glowing sentinels, their reach spilling into alleys and illuminating front porches that had once vanished into darkness. Every corner no longer belonged to shadows, and still, the fear didn't break. Night patrols doubled. Not just officers, but hastily deputized civilians. Shopkeepers, blacksmiths, postmen took turns walking the blocks, rifles in hand, boots crunching gravel with each slow step. The rhythm of Austin had changed. Laughter had vanished from its saloons. Music fell silent in its neighborhoods. Families no longer lingered at their dinner tables. Everyone listened, now, for creaks in floorboards, for breath that didn't belong, for something they couldn't name, but desperately hoped to hear coming, before it was too late. The city had reacted with structure, with steel, with firelight. It had armored itself the only way it knew how, with visibility. But none of it reached the killer. The gas lamps didn't stop him. The patrols didn't frighten him. The fear didn't satisfy him. Still, the killings continue. Even with the street lamps burning and rifles lining windowsills, the shadow didn't recede. The killer adapted. Where once he moved in darkness, now he slipped between pools of artificial light, choosing routes the lanterns could not reach. Where patrols marched loudly in groups, he waited for their backs to turn. And when vigilance relaxed, because it always did, he struck again. Each new victim bore the marks of someone who no longer feared discovery. If anything, the killer seemed emboldened by the city's panic, feeding off it like oxygen. The killings were swifter now, but more grotesque. In some cases, entire households were bypassed, just to reach the one bed he'd chosen. Tools were taken from the very yards of his victims. Axes left leaning by sheds. Irons cooling near wood stoves turned into weapons and then into messages. The police tightened their noose around anyone but the killer. The public, already fraying, began to turn on itself. By December, Austin no longer waited for news of another murder. It braced for it. And then, on the night of Christmas Eve, as carols echoed faintly through the streets and fires warmed parlors across the city, it happened. December 24, 1885. The final and most brutal attack. Christmas Eve should have brought comfort, the clink of cutlery and quiet. Laughter had returned to Austin's wealthier homes, if only briefly. The illusion of safety, polished like silver for one more night. Gas lamps flickered. Parlors glowed with hearthlight. Children pressed their faces to frosted window panes, watching stars shimmer through the winter haze. But in the hours just before midnight, the killer returned. The first to fall was Susan Hancock, a refined woman. A mother, respected, loved. She lived on San Antonio Street, in a solid, well-lit home not far from the capital, the very heart of the city's promise. She and her husband had gone to bed after a quiet evening. By the time he woke, his wife was gone. Outside, in the backyard, Susan's body lay as the others had, dragged from her bed, beaten with a heavy object, her head crushed and mutilated. A steel rod had been driven into her skull with such force that it embedded in the soil beneath. Her nightgown was shredded, her body arranged with awful intent. The snow that had fallen earlier had softened to slush, turning red beneath her feet. The city had no time to respond. Just hours later, before the sun could rise on Christmas morning, the killer struck again. Eula Phillips, just 20 years old, married to a prominent builder, mother of a small child, was found barely a few blocks away. The details mirrored the others: skull smashed, body dragged, sexually desecrated. But the violence was even more grotesque. Her head was battered almost beyond recognition. She had been left beneath a pecan tree, one leg drawn unnaturally high, her eyes still open to the stars. The horror was unmistakable, and unmistakably deliberate. He had taken two women. Two white women. Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, slain just hours apart in the killer's final and most brutal assault. They were women of grace and standing, mothers whose homes stood within walking distance of Texas's political heart. Susan Hancock had dined quietly with her husband and daughter that evening, their Christmas tree lit, gifts tucked beneath its branches. Hours later, her husband awoke to find blood trailing from the bedroom and the back door ajar. Outside, beneath the cold canopy of trees, Susan's body had been dragged into the yard, her skull fractured open, her body violated with a sharpened metal spike, embedded so violently it pinned her to the earth. Before the coroner could finish recording her wounds, another scream fractured the winter stillness. Just across the city, not 2 miles away, Eula Phillips was attacked in almost identical fashion. Her husband lay unconscious from a blow to the head. She was missing. Found later beneath a pecan tree, her skull crushed, her face bludgeoned to pulp, her clothing torn away. She'd been placed, not just killed. Her legs twisted unnaturally, arms splayed. Another grim signature. This wasn't escalation. This was conclusion. Final. Intentional. Two women, chosen carefully. Taken the same night. Killed in the exact same style. Both killed in the exact same style. There was no ambiguity now. No chance that these were isolated events, or crimes of passion, or the work of different hands. The marks were too distinct, the methodology too cruel, and too consistent. Austin's people, already trembling beneath the weight of fear, now saw the truth in grotesque symmetry. Two white women, taken on the same night, murdered with the same weapon, positioned with the same disturbing deliberateness. This wasn't a fluke. It was a signature. The city had hoped that wealth, or race, or reputation might insulate someone. Anyone. But the killer had burned that hope away like paper. There was no safety. Not in bed. Not behind gates. Not even beneath the lights that now lined the city's avenues. He had walked beneath them and struck anyway, bold as thunder. And so, Austin cracked. The city broke. What had once been fear spiraled into hysteria. Patrols swelled into mobs. Every stranger was hunted. Every rumor taken as fact. Men with rifles roamed the streets without orders or badges, not searching for a killer, but for vengeance, for scapegoats, for something to punish that might finally bleed. People no longer whispered behind curtains. They shouted from windows. Innocents were seized. The air itself seemed flammable. Austin had become what it feared most: a city, ruled by night, by blood, and by chaos. Mobs now roamed the streets. The streets of Austin no longer slept. Church bells rang not for prayer, but for alarm. Hysteria gripped the city like a fever, and it spared no one. Groups of armed men, some deputized, many not, roamed the neighborhoods at night, searching barns, peering through windows, stopping strangers with rifles raised. Any man traveling alone after dusk was a suspect. Any black man seen near a white home could be beaten without cause. Lanterns swung from porches. Torches lit alleyways. Dogs barked through every hour. It didn't matter. The killer was always one step ahead. In some neighborhoods, vigilantes dragged suspects from their beds. Innocent men were shackled and thrown into basements for questioning. Whispers of lynching passed between clenched teeth. The authorities had lost control, and in the vacuum of certainty, the city turned inward. Paranoid, panicked, half-mad. Business slowed. Schools half-emptied. Social calls vanished, and still women died. The chaos demanded a name, something to pin this terror on. Something to point at in headlines and pulpits and late night whispers. And so, after months of euphemisms and evasions, the press gave the killer his title. They called him the Midnight Assassin. A name born of ink, fear, and the city's desperate need to define what haunted it. A name that finally acknowledged what so many had already feared. He was no random madman. He was method. He was deliberate. He was still out there. With a name came myth, the Midnight Assassin. It rolled off the presses with theatrical gravity, each syllable sharpened by fear. The newspapers seized it like a brand. Headlines blared with fresh urgency. Columns swelled with speculation. He wasn't just a killer now. He was a persona, a terror set in type, haunting every breakfast table and street corner conversation. The name stripped him of humanity and cloaked him in legend. And in that shadow, the truth became even harder to see. Editors indulged in lurid detail. Some wrote of a monster loosed upon the city. Others leaned on metaphor. The spectre of death walks with us yet. They diagrammed crime scenes, debated motive, mapped the murders like a constellation of doom. If it wasn't clear before, it was now. Austin wasn't just facing a tragedy. It was becoming the backdrop of a national mystery, a city swallowed by its own story. And as the Midnight Assassin's legend deepened, so did the theories. A madman, some said, escaped from an asylum, a lunatic driven by moonlight and blood. A demon, others whispered, summoned by sin, immune to man's justice, a punishment in flesh. A former slave seeking vengeance claimed some white citizens, projecting their guilt into fiction. A foreign butcher insisted a few, perhaps a European immigrant with knowledge of anatomy and an appetite for death. None of it fit. All of it fit. Because the truth still crouched somewhere out there. Silent, smiling, watching. Theories flourished like mold in the dark. Madman, the simplest answer for a world that refused to make sense. Perhaps a lunatic had slipped through the cracks of an asylum. A mind shattered by grief or hunger or war. Someone with no motive beyond the pull of blood, stalking the streets in a trance of violence. It was comforting, in a way, because madness could be contained, treated, locked away behind iron bars. A demon, others claimed, serious as scripture. There were those who saw patterns in the moon phases, who counted the wounds like runes. Ministers warned of sin, festering in the heart of the city, of curses brought by moral decay. What else could explain such inhuman cruelty? What else but something that had never breathed mortal air? A former slave? Some speculated, whispered behind closed doors, by those too cowardly to say it aloud. A man bent on vengeance, striking out against the families of old masters, punishing the city for the generations of blood and silence that built it. And it wasn't so much a theory as a confession, buried in myth. Guilt dressed up as prophecy. And then, the foreign butcher. Imagined by the city's educated. Someone skilled in dissection, newly arrived by rail or ship, slipping through Austin's growing crowds. Perhaps he was from Germany, or London. Maybe someone who'd once worked in a slaughterhouse, now turning blades against something softer than livestock. The unfamiliar face, the strange accent, they became a mask for whatever horror couldn't be named. Theories gave people something to cling to, something to point at. But they were just shadows wearing borrowed skin. Most suspects were falsely accused and eventually released. The real killer remained, unseen, untraced, unbroken. The arrests had become a carousel of desperation. Most suspects were falsely accused and quietly released. One by one, men were dragged in. Cooks, drifters, ex-soldiers, even husbands of the murdered. And then let go days or weeks later, when the evidence vanished under scrutiny. Some confessed under duress. Others were named by vigilantes eager to soothe their fear with action. The police didn't seem to care if a man was guilty, only that he could be made to look guilty. It was enough to calm the crowds, for a moment. Enough to fill a column in the paper, but never enough to stop the killings. The same names circled the headlines, recycled and rewritten. Investigators contradicted one another. Witness statements collapsed. Jail cells filled and emptied in rhythm with public outrage. The only real pattern that emerged was failure. Eventually, to satisfy the growing pressure for justice, any justice, a few men were brought to trial. Their courtrooms packed with spectators, their faces etched into wanted posters and courtroom sketches. But no murder weapon was ever found. No eyewitness could place them at the scene. Their accusers, when pressed, crumbled. In each case, the prosecution came armed with suspicion and fear, but not evidence. A few were tried and publicly acquitted. Cleared not by mercy, but by the sheer absence of proof. The midnight assassin, it seemed, had left nothing behind but ruin. Courtrooms grew crowded. Judges grew tired. A few suspects were brought before juries, faces drawn, and hands shaking as the charges were read aloud. Murder, mutilation, terrorizing a city. But the evidence was paper thin. The prosecution leaned on circumstantial detail, a man's presence nearby, a past quarrel, a suspicious gaze remembered weeks too late. Some witnesses had never seen the crime, only heard about it in the press. Others contradicted themselves within minutes on the stand. The defense needed only to hold up the mirror. No bloodstains, no eyewitness, no proof. Juries listened long. And one by one, they returned with the same verdict: not guilty. The acquitted men left the courthouse in silence, not so much freed as spared. None of them stayed in Austin. Meanwhile, the public grew restless. Justice had failed. The killer had not been caught. And yet, for all the noise and panic, the grip of death was easing. Because in early 1886, the murders stop. Just like that. No final victim, no captured suspect, no sudden flash of justice. One day, the city wakes expecting more blood, and there's none. A week passes. Then two. No screams in the night. No women dragged from their beds. The gaslights still burn. The night patrols still march. But the darkness, once prowled by a phantom, is now just darkness again. Austin doesn't trust the silence. At first, the quiet feels like a trick, a pause before the next horror. But spring comes, then summer. The headlines shift. Political drama. Drop business. Life attempts to resume its rhythm, but there's a hitch in every step, a shadow in every breath. The midnight assassin had vanished without a trace, the same way he came. No justice, no reckoning, just absence. People try to explain it, because how could they not? Theories rise again, this time not of who the killer is, but where he went. Most believe he simply left town, a traveling laborer, a drifter passing through. Maybe he boarded a train one dawn with nothing but a duffel and the smell of iron on his hands, slipping into another city like smoke. Or maybe he never left at all. The idea caught fire almost as quickly as the killings had ceased. People speculated the midnight assassin had left town. Maybe he fled by horseback, or boarded a freight train at dawn. Just another suit-covered worker with a blank stare and bloody hands tucked deep in his coat. Austin, they said, had simply been one stop on a longer, darker journey. He vanished not because he was done, but because he was done here. There was nothing left to prove, no one left to terrify. That theory comforted some. They wanted to believe the horror had a passport, that it lived elsewhere now, far from their doorways. But others saw a deeper chill in that idea, because if he was gone, where had he gone? The whispers started small, a curiosity shared between newspaper editors and amateur sleuths. But by the end of the decade, it had taken on mythic weight. A few claimed he moved to London in 1888 and became Jack the Ripper. The idea began as a whisper in the margins. A speculative murmur passed between detectives and amateur sleuths. But by the early 20th century, it had evolved into a full-blown legend. What if the midnight assassin didn't stop killing? He simply changed cities in 1888. Just 3 years after the last brutal murders in Austin, London's East End was gripped by its own nightmare. Women, most of them sex workers, were found murdered in alleys and courtyards, their throats slashed, their bodies mutilated, one by one. They were carved up with surgical precision, and London's fear suddenly bore a familiar shape. The idea took hold. The midnight assassin had crossed the Atlantic. That he had gone underground in Texas, avoided capture, and re-emerged in Whitechapel under a new name, Jack the Ripper. The similarities were tantalizing. Both struck at night. Both targeted vulnerable women. Both seemed to vanish without a trace. Both cases ended without answers, leaving only theories, trauma, and a trail of blood too cold to follow. The Ripper case, like Austin's before it, would remain unsolved. Its legacy fueled not by justice, but by fascination. And that fascination refused to fade. The similarities between victims and methods sparked decades of obsession. Not just with who the killer was, but with whether he'd ever truly stopped. The parallels were too eerie for many to ignore. Both killers favored the cover of night. Both selected female victims, vulnerable, isolated, often asleep or alone. Both inflicted grotesque injuries that went far beyond mere murder, seeming almost ritualistic in their depravity. And crucially, both evaded capture entirely, slipping through law enforcement's fingers, as if they were made of mist. Writers, detectives, conspiracy theorists, they all pounced on the mystery. Book after book drew lines across the Atlantic. The Midnight Assassin's last murder in 1885, and Jack the Ripper's first in 1888. The timeline fit, so did the methods. Even the idea of a phantom killer who taunted a growing metropolis felt familiar. Over the decades, the theory took on mythic life. Articles speculated, films toyed with the idea. Some even claimed to have found shipping records, evidence of an American laborer traveling to England in the spring of '86. But the proof was always thin, the connections frayed at the edges. Historians remained skeptical, because in the end, no real connection was ever proven. The names remained separate. The trails, though chillingly similar, never truly crossed. No real connection was ever proven. The timelines lined up, the methods echoed, and the mythologies felt like mirror images stretched across an ocean. But time wears away its certainty. Historians conned archives. Ripperologists debated ink, stained theories. The names of men passed through both cities, some real, some invented, but none linked the blood of Austin to the fog of Whitechapel in a way that could withstand scrutiny. The lines never truly met. The wounds may have looked alike, but the shadows behind them remained separate. The midnight assassin vanished without justice, and Jack the Ripper emerged with the same cruel legacy, but from a different mist, in a different city, under a different name. But Austin never found its killer, not a suspect, not a grave, not even a whisper that could close the chapter. Only the echo of footsteps that once slipped through the gaslit dark and were never heard again. But Austin never found its killer, the man who terrorized the city for a full year, who crept through alleyways and bedrooms, who silenced women and shattered families, was never named, never caught, never punished. He slipped out of history with the same grace he entered it, unannounced and untraceable. The city moved on, or pretended to. Streets were repaved, homes were sold, the gas lamps burned, then dimmed with time. New generations were born with no memory of the blood that once soaked the soil beneath their feet. But the stories stayed, in hushed conversations passed between grandparents and grandchildren, in yellowed newsprint tucked into attics, in the occasional footnote of Texas history, and always in the unnerving silence of a case that never closed. The killer had no trial, no gallows, no grave with a name, but the echo of his crimes endured, like a phantom caught between 2 centuries. And though the language didn't exist at the time, the pattern was unmistakable. The phrase, serial killer, hadn't been coined yet, but this was one. Long before headlines gave such men a name, Austin met its first, and never forgot him. The phrase, serial killer, didn't exist yet, but this was one. In the 1880s, no terminology captured what Austin was witnessing. The notion that one man could kill again and again, across months, with chilling ritual and no personal motive. It didn't fit within the crime books or courtroom logic of the time. The city groped for language. Fiend, maniac, midnight monster. But none of those grasped the method behind the madness. There was a pattern, even if no one could see it clearly through the fog of fear. Only decades later, when the term serial killer emerged in criminology, did the pieces retroactively click into place. Multiple victims, similar means, a compulsion, an evolving signature, and a killer who stopped, not because of conscience or capture, but on his own timeline. Austin, without knowing it, had stood on the frontier of a new kind of horror. By the time it was over, 8 people were dead, possibly more. Official counts listed 7 women and 1 child, but others speculated about earlier attacks, unconnected deaths, quiet cover-ups. The body count may never be known. Only one truth remains: someone walked among them and vanished. 8 dead, possibly more. That was the official count when the city dared to tally its grief. 8 lives, each taken in the quiet hours before dawn, each snuffed out with the same brutal precision. But whispered beneath that total were the names not printed in the papers. Women who had been assaulted but survived. others found in suspicious circumstances, before the city understood what it was dealing with. Some say the killer's spree may have started earlier, that he had been practicing in silence before the city began to count his dead. The timeline, like the killer, may have always been elusive. And the victims, they shared more than just their fate. They were all women. And most came from the edges of society. Black servants, recently emancipated but still bound by poverty. Poor immigrants, who crossed oceans only to find death in alleys and outbuildings. A few, like Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, had wealth, marriage, and standing, but they came last, when the city was already on its knees. Mostly poor black, or immigrant, and largely invisible in a city that hadn't wanted to see them until it was far too late. All women. Mostly poor, black, or immigrant. They were laundresses and cooks, chambermaids and caretakers. They lived in the margins, tucked into servant quarters behind stately homes, or crowded into alley shanties the city tried not to see. Their names rarely appeared in social columns or civic registers. In many cases, they'd escaped one kind of violence: slavery, poverty, war, only to encounter another no one understood, let alone stopped. They were the invisible threads holding Austin's social order together. Until someone began cutting those threads, one by one. Their deaths followed a logic the city couldn't, or wouldn't, recognize. But in hindsight, there was a structure. Victims selected with care, stalked in silence, attacked while sleeping, dragged from their beds into the open, murdered with staggering brutality. These were not impulsive acts of rage. They were ritual, composed and repeated with chilling deliberation. The newspapers didn't yet have the language. The police certainly didn't. But the clues were there, etched in the bodies, and the silence that followed. This was the first documented pattern in the United States of stalking, method, nighttime ritual, and sexual mutilation. The blueprint of a phenomenon not yet named, but one the world would learn to fear. Long before profiling became a science and decades before the term serial killer entered the public lexicon. Austin bore silent witness to something unprecedented in American criminal history. The killer didn't just strike again and again. He struck with structure. He stalked his victims, often watching for nights. He chose them carefully: maids, laundresses, young mothers, most vulnerable in homes no one thought to protect. He came when the city slept, always between midnight and dawn. And when he left a message. Not in ink, but in mutilation and ritual. The method was eerily consistent: forced entry, blunt trauma, the dragging of bodies to outdoor spaces, the brutal desecration, and always the sense that these were not acts of passion, but ceremonial violence. Not just to kill, but to communicate something dark. Something only he understood. There had been murderers before. There had even been repeat killers. But nothing with this level of repetition, refinement, and symbolic cruelty. The pattern became a blueprint. For those who study criminal behavior today, it marked a beginning. Not just of fear, but of a phenomenon that would stretch across centuries. The servant girl Annihilator set the template. Long before the FBI coined behavioral profiles, before crime scene tape sectioned off the macabre from the mundane. This unknown figure laid down a blueprint, one that investigators would only begin to understand decades later. In his silence, he taught future monsters how to evade. In his pattern, he showed them how to terrify. In the pages of criminal history, where Ted Bundy and the Zodiac loom large, Austin's phantom came first. And yet, he remains a footnote, because Austin moved on. Years became decades, then centuries. The dirt lanes were paved horse-drawn carriages traded for Teslas and trams. The city's modest skyline gave way to mirrored towers. Music and barbecue brought tourists. Startups brought wealth. And with every layer of glass and steel, the past sank deeper beneath the surface, its blood washed away by the glow of LED screens and touchscreen dreams. Austin is now a tech city. Busy, modern, glass buildings stretching toward the sun. But somewhere in its shadow, the old story still flickers, waiting. Austin is now a tech city. Restless, gleaming, reborn. From the banks of Lady Bird Lake to the thrum of 6th Street, it hums with innovation. Glass towers glint under the Texas sun, startups rise and fall before lunch, and scooters zip past coffee shops, where coders architect the future. The city that once feared silence now celebrates noise-live music, brunch queues, the click of keyboards echoing down co-working corridors. Its haunted past, buried beneath smart landscaping and downtown renovations. Tourists flock to food trucks, not ghost tours. Residents whisper more about IPOs than unsolved crimes. On most maps, the old neighborhoods are gone. Renamed, rezoned, gentrified beyond recognition. But cities have memories, even the ones they don't want. And in the stillest corners, where the gaslight would have flickered, where footsteps once echoed too softly, some say the ghosts of the victims still linger. In dreams. In shadows. In the quiet between Austin's beats. But in the quietest parts of town, some say the ghosts of the victims still linger. They don't rattle chains or drift beneath moonlight. They don't need to. Their presence lives elsewhere, in the way certain homes seem colder than they should be, in side streets that locals walk a little faster to escape, in the hush that falls over conversations when someone brings up those murders, the old ones. Every so often, a child claims to hear footsteps outside their window. A dog growls at nothing near the back fence. Someone swears they saw a figure vanish between lampposts, too tall and too still. The city doesn't acknowledge it. Not officially. Not in brochures or walking tours. But some Austinites still light candles on certain dates. Some leave flowers by trees that no longer stand. Some remember what most have tried to forget, a history written in blood, not bronze. And though time has dulled the edges of fear, it has not erased the names. Their names were Molly, Eliza, Mary, Clara, Irene. They came from different walks of life, but shared the same fate. Erased not just by violence, but by time. Their stories, when told, were often incomplete. Some were buried with only a first name remembered. Others had their deaths overshadowed by the morbid curiosity surrounding the man who took them. In the aftermath, the city asked who had done this, but rarely paused long enough to ask who it had happened to. The papers obsessed over theories, suspects, patterns. The names of the victims became shorthand. The cook, the servant girl, the wife. Their voices were lost in the noise that followed, reduced to exhibits in a mystery more interested in the monster than the women he hunted. They should have been remembered first, but like so many women, so many poor women, black women, immigrant women, they became background to someone else's legend. And they were forgotten long before the killer was. Their graves settled into the earth, names worn soft by weather and time. The city paved over their stories, first with indifference, then with progress. Meanwhile, the killer's legend endured, whispered in books, speculated in forums, studied in classrooms. He became a question mark wrapped in midnight. They became silence. But history, when told right, is an act of unearthing. So this story, their story, deserves to be remembered not for the man who ended it, but for the lives that filled it. They were more than victims. They were women. They were loved. They mattered. Disclaimer: This story is based on historical events surrounding the Austin murders of 1884-1885. We've done our best to stay faithful to documented facts and credible research. However, gaps in the historical record, conflicting reports, and changing terminology across time mean some details may be interpretive or incomplete. Now, close your eyes. The gaslights have dimmed. The streets are quiet again. You're safe. Let your breath slow, your thoughts settle. Leave the shadows behind. Just for now. Good night, sleep well.